It's that time of year. Chris Mason gives his verdict on the official Christmas tree in Trafalgar Square. Chris, what do you reckon?
How did I get into this last year? What was it?
By using the word girth, that's how you got into it.
Yeah, I was sort of perhaps gently critical, wasn't I? Just kind of how stick thin the Christmas tree was. That gift from Norway that stands in Trafalgar Square. I reckon this year's is better. Feels a bit sort of plumper around the waist, which seems to me the more classic conical Christmas tree shape. Anyway, that's about as much analysis as anyone wants on my Christmas tree.
The problem is, though, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, his visits are getting earlier every year, so you missed him last week. So
no, he's not here to hear that praise, which he'd be desperate to hear, no doubt. Yeah.
Anyway, let's see what we've got in store on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And keeping us company this week are Aisha Hazarika from Times Radio and former Labour advisor. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Do you have a Christmas tree?
I do. It just got to
girthy? Is it girthy?
It's plump and full of girth.
Glad to hear.
And also here is Will Walden, who was former Director of Communications for Boris Johnson. Hello again.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Adam.
And also when Boris was Mayor of London. So did you ever have to deal with the Christmas tree?
I didn't have to deal with the Christmas tree. I have difficulty enough dealing with my own Christmas tree, let alone one in Trafalgar Square.
One is enough. Sized one is enough. Right. We're obviously going to talk about Boris Johnson being at the COVID inquiry for a second day running. That's his evidence finish now. But first of all, actually, Westminster was dominated by another big story today, which kind of drew quite a lot of attention away from that in quite a surprising way. But also day two of the fallout from the Rwanda plan.
Yeah.
So just remind us where we've got to.
So quick recap. This week, the government hoped, prior to Boris Johnson's appearance at the COVID inquiry, would be dominated politically by them resetting their approach to immigration. So Monday, legal migration and their plans for that. And then Tuesday, illegal migration and the whole question of this Rwanda plan, the idea of sending some migrants to Rwanda. Home Secretary went out to Kigali. I went out as a reporter to report on it. There was that sense of, and the vibe that was being given off was one of, look, there was all that chaos and noise from the previous Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. Now we're getting on with delivery. And they had, to be fair to them, set out their policies on legal migration on the Monday, and then this treaty that they've signed with Rwanda on Tuesday. But then we see the resignation of Robert Jenrick, the immigration minister, and then this sort of hastily arranged news conference on Thursday morning from the Prime Minister. This Prime Minister does not like doing news conferences. And why did he do it? Because they kind of run out of better ideas. You've got to go out and sell an idea as Prime Minister if nobody else is doing, particularly if you've got your former immigration minister who's saying it's a dud. So that's what he did to try and claim that he's found this really narrow path to trying to make this policy work. But the interesting thing is, even when you speak to people in government and on the Conservative backbenches who like the idea, they still say, but will this way actually make it work?
Because there's a bit when you look in this draft legislation that people will still be able to go to court over being sent to Rwanda, perhaps in very, very narrow circumstances and a lot narrower than they currently can, but still possible.
It is still possible. And politically, the imperative is on trying to get people onto those planes before the general election, i.e. very, very quickly in the framework of passing laws and potential legal challenges. So, yeah, that's kind of where we are.
Aisha, as a former advisor, press conferences can be good, but hastily arranged ones are rarely good.
Quite. And also press conferences where you look very tetchy and sort of very, very frustrated and very frazzled as well are not ideal.
Actually, you know what? Let's let newscasters decide whether he was frazzled or tetchy, where he was on that scale. And here's a compilation of him being asked probing questions by Chris Mason and other editors.
Are you saying to your MPs bluntly on all of this, back me or sack me?
What I'm saying, not just to my MPs, but the entire country, is that I share their frustration.
Will next week's vote be treated as a vote of confidence in your government? And will you throw Conservative MPs out of the party if they defy you?
You don't know. But what this vote is about confidence in Parliament.
You've lost control of your party, and this has become a confidence issue, not in Parliament, but in you. Do you accept that, and will you call an election if you lose these votes?
What's happening here is we're delivering on what I said.
Back to you, Aisha. There was a theme to the questions and the answers there, wasn't there?
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is how Rwanda has just become the absolute flashpoint for the Conservative Party. It was like a kind of quite out there idea which Priti Patel came up with back in the day. And it is fascinating how it has become this thing which has just totally dominated the Conservative Party. And there's so many, for something which there was this obsession with, there are also so many unanswered questions. Like, you know, when you dig into the detail, there are questions like, you know, could we end up in this ridiculous unintended consequence where Rwanda could send us refugees before we've sent any, you know, migrants out there as well?
Bit in the treaty that suggests that's possible.
And with all treaties, so much of this is about the fine print, right? The idea that also in the treaty, you know, for all this bluster, for all this political capital, you're talking, if things go really, really well, 100 people. So I just felt like this is something which just, do you remember that documentary about the Fire Festival, which was this festival where everything went wrong and the organisers just kept going with it? People were like, this is a disaster, there's no food, there's no water, there's no accommodation. They were like, fine, just crack on. I feel like this is turning into the sort of political equivalent of the Fire Festival.
And yes, I'm just thinking about the extreme things people did to get water in that documentary, but let's not delve into that. Will, I mean, how has Rishi Sunak ended up in this position? Because basically, as Aisha was saying, the Rwanda policy has sort of become the 2023 version of Brexit. Yeah. And Brexit was about the fate of the entire country.
Yeah, I mean, look, declaration, I don't like the idea of Conservative governments tinkering with legal frameworks, you know, period. But they're trying to do that. And I think he's only got himself to blame. He's put the whole Rwanda issue and the small boats issue so front and centre that nothing else is talked about. And if you care about immigration, but you don't care about it in principle terms, you're more worried about the cost of living, you're going to be wondering, what on earth are they doing? If you do care about immigration, what you're going to be looking at is thinking, well, the boats are still coming. He says they're down, but they're still coming. And he hasn't sent anyone to Rwanda, and it doesn't look like he's going to be able to. So he's created this mess, unfortunately, himself. But what staggers me is that the Conservative Party used to be known for its pragmatism, and it's just gone again. And we're facing this ridiculous prospect of potentially losing a vote, which would presumably lead to an early general election, or having another vote of confidence in a prime minister. It is becoming ridiculous. And in short order, they've got to get their house together. Otherwise, it's just curtains.
Well, let's be fair to Rishi Sunak, and we've given lots of airtime to criticisms of the Rwanda policy. Here's how he presented this as a win at the press conference today.
So the bill does include what are known as notwithstanding clauses. These mean that our domestic courts will no longer be able to use any domestic or international law, including the Human Rights Act, to stop us removing illegal migrants. Let me just go through the ways that individual illegal migrants try and stay. Claiming asylum, that's now blocked. Abuse of our modern slavery rules, blocked. The idea that Rwanda isn't safe, blocked. The risk of being sent to some other country, blocked. And spurious human rights claims, you'd better believe that we've blocked those too, because we're completely disapplying all the relevant sections of the Human Rights Act.
Some real crowd pleasers there. You better believe it a bit, isn't it? You're like, this is quite technical international law here.
It's not like a bad game show host, isn't it? Blocked. I do, picking up on what Will said, I think the thing that's extraordinary about this is when you look at an issue that ends up dominating a party, like when Theresa May became Prime Minister, and of course Brexit became the dominant issue. She didn't choose to raise Brexit and make it the dominant issue. It was sort of thrust upon her whether she wanted to or not. But Rishi Sunak, like a moth to the flame, just keeps coming back to Rwanda. There's plenty of other things that he could be talking about. You could make an argument that Jeremy Hunt and he have actually done some, good work trying to turn the economy around. The inflation is coming down. They could talk a bit more about their industrial strategy, etc., etc. But all roads seem to lead back to Rwanda.
They did. I mean, in defence of Rishi Sunak, he did inherit the Rwanda policy, didn't he? So junking it would have come with a political cost or something, because someone would have said, "Oh, you've surrendered. This is an idea. We should see it."
But
through.
Instead, he put it front and centre.
And let's be honest, Chris, there are many ideas that he inherited which have just withered on the vine. Social care was a big promise that he inherited. We hear nothing about social care now. HS2 was a big thing he inherited, and he'd said, right, okay, it's clearly not working. I'm going to junk it now. Levelling up was something which was a great prize that he inherited. So what I can't understand is why he is willing to just burn so much political capital on this. And the other thing, which I think is fascinating, given that he has made this centre stage, this big vote we think is going to come on Tuesday, he's now backing off this being a matter of confidence. He's saying to people, actually, if you vote against us, you won't lose the whip on this. And, and I'm not going to make this an issue. We're not going to call a general election over this. So he's kind of leading everybody up saying, this is the biggest thing that matters to me, but I'm actually not going to make it about confidence in me.
Just to say, immigration is important, but is it the defining issue in the next election? And I would argue that if he wants to go to October or even to January next year, it's going to be the cost of living. It's going to be where people's mortgages are. And if he's going to demonstrate that he possibly can turn the polls around and potentially win, it's going to be on that stuff. It's not going to be on immigration. And in putting it front and centre, what he's doing is he's not winning on that argument, but he's also saying to other people, well, the other stuff, does that really matter? And that's a problem.
And Chris, when we listen to people like Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, on the Today programme on Thursday morning, and she's giving her criticism of this Rwanda plan and then denies it's about her wanting to be Prime Minister, should we not believe her? And then when we read Robert Jenrick's letter, where he criticises the Rwanda plan but doesn't really come up with any alternatives that would work better, and actually he ends with a bit of a rhetorical flourish that sounds like maybe he would quite like to be Prime Minister as well. Should we not believe him?
Well, I think sort of both things can be true. I mean, I think from Robert Jenrick's perspective, he looked at this bill and just thought, can I authentically be the kind of face and voice for it and go out and take all the questions about it whilst believing in it, and concluded that the answer to that was no, because when the critique would have been put to him that says, yeah, but hang on a minute, it's still going to get gummed up in the court, so are you really going to get very many people, if any, on a plane before the election? He couldn't conceivably say yes with any conviction because he didn't believe it himself. So in the end, that's just kind of, just a policy dispute. He and Suella Braverman would say, look, the Prime Minister has to be much more bold around the whole question of the European Convention on Human Rights and all of that. Those who make that argument do accept, though, to make the Brexit parallel again, that kind of thing's Brexit 2.0. That's a massive conversation that has all sorts of knock-on consequences, both in this policy field and loads of others. As is often said, but it's worth saying, it's written into the Good Friday Agreement, for instance. So it's incredibly kind of big and complicated. So I think from his perspective, given that he walked rather than was sacked, like Suella Braverman, it was a point of just not being able to push ahead with it.
Aisha, Rishi Sunak got a bit of stick in the press conference for ignoring all his own political problems with his party and saying, yeah, but what about Labour? What's their plan? They're the ones who are in real trouble, which drew a few titters on social media. But do you think Labour has a convincing alternative, like an anti-Rwanda plan?
Well, I think what's fascinating about this is immigration has always been a very, very historically tricky issue for the Labour Party.
Well, I remember an election campaign you were involved in where there was a mug that Ed Miliband
yes.
controls on immigration to stop selling the mug because it was a controversial mug.
The people were not happy about the mug, and eventually we had too many mugs in the kitchen and someone said, oh, do you think we should send them back to where they came from? We're like, you can't say that about the immigration mug, for goodness sake. For goodness sake. Honestly, people, honestly.
So the immigration, the mug's still here, presumably.
Look, you look back to Mrs. Duffy, the Labour Party's always had it's always very difficult to position immigration on the Labour Party for a number of reasons. And yet, because of the mess with Rwanda and the general immigration backlog, you've seen this sort of strange confidence from Labour about attacking the Tories on immigration. Keir Starmer has led on it at Prime Minister's Questions, had probably his best ever Prime Minister's Questions leading on the migration figures. So I think Labour feels like they're in quite a good position on migration. I mean, interestingly, if you look at the announcements that James Cleverly made on Monday, I don't think the Labour Party's probably going to roll back on too many of them. So I think the issue of the threshold and spouses is probably going to be a bit of an emotional flashpoint that the Labour Party could have a sort of different sort of view on. But I think when it comes to that vote on Tuesday, as much as Rishi Sunak blusters about the Labour Party is not going to back. The Labour Party is not going to hold out the hand of friendship and give Rishi Sunak a political lifeline on a plan that they fundamentally disagree with. I mean, they're not going to carry on with Rwanda.
If there was to be a vote of confidence in Rishi Sunak, and that does seem like kind of jumping a lot of hurdles all at once, are people doing a tally of how many people have sent letters to the 1922 committee like we used to do with previous prime ministers?
This is where the old deja vu all over again kicks in, and people are talking about letters, and people are speculating about numbers, and nobody knows other than Graham Brady, who keeps them all. So we're in that kind of world again where a lot of folk, both those who are not particularly keen on Rishi Sunak and those who are, fear it happening almost by accident. Because you go away over Christmas or whatever and Conservative MPs ponder and mull, and then you might think, oh, you know what, on balance, maybe I'll put that letter in, but you're not quite sure, and then you put it in, and blimey, it's the whatever it is, the 53rd, or I think it's 53.
I just love the fact that Graham Brady has said he's standing down, but it's almost like one last gig, one last job.
Really love it.
And also the Christmas post, I hope they're all handing them in by hand, otherwise it could be a very random day that it all happens. Right, let's talk about the other big story that people have been looking at on the second screen of their other phone or their other laptop, if you're lucky to have two laptops in Westminster. Some people do. Boris Johnson doing his second day of evidence at the COVID inquiry. Will, you've spent a lot of time with Boris Johnson over the years, and we spent a lot of time asking you about it. But was that a Boris Johnson that you recognised? Like quite serious, quite emotional, quite contrite? Ish.
And I think that's
you made a very ish face.
Yeah, I did, didn't I? And I think that's the point. Boris does do contrite, and I think he nearly died from this virus, and you saw a very emotional Boris Johnson this afternoon when he discussed that, and I think all of that is genuine.
Let's watch it, and people can see this emotional Boris Johnson.
I haven't talked about this before in public, and it goes to what you were saying earlier about elderly people and my what you claim is my indifference to the pandemic. I just want to remind you that when I went into ITU intensive care, I saw around me a lot of people who were not actually elderly. In fact, they were middle-aged men, and they were quite like me. And some of us were going to make it, and some of us weren't.
It was a tough watch, and that is the real Boris Johnson. He can do contrition, understanding, emotion, empathy, sympathy. But there's also another Boris Johnson, and that was also on show, and that is the Boris Johnson that never quite manages to apologise. So I wrote down a couple of things. We always hear from him, I didn't say it, or I did, but others were saying it too, or I take responsibility, but it wasn't as it's been reported. And that's the problem, is that there is a level of contrition, and that Boris Johnson is the real Boris Johnson, but so is the Boris Johnson that I know will have said, let it rip. There is a conflict at the heart of Boris, and this is the way that he operates. So I think what we saw over the last couple of days was he generally managed to keep it in check, and I think that's very much about the audience. It's not a bunch of MPs on a select committee, it is the families of the bereaved, and he was clearly well coached in that.
Who were sitting just up
who were sitting and would have been very hard for them and very hard for him. So, he absolutely respected that. But what you got throughout was a sense that he wasn't quite owning the apology. And there were a couple of really interesting things yesterday when he talked about in Margaret Thatcher's government, if they had had WhatsApp, it would have been just as fruity. Any government would have acted the same. And I know you've heard from all my advisors slagging me off about my competence, but they were just stressed. And that's just hokum. It's just rubbish, and Boris knows it is, and he's come here and he's almost pulled out. He's almost, because he hasn't attacked anyone personally, and he's kind of saying there was a failure and I take responsibility for that, but by the way, it was a collective failure. And I think this is all about resetting the dial on his own reputation. This is about pitch rolling for the future, not for a political comeback or anything like that, but just him being able to say, yes, I get it. The problem is, I think that the way that he talks sometimes betrays the fact that he both gets it and he doesn't get it, and that's the problem.
What was it? A disputatious
Oh,
culture
disputatious,
is
yeah.
better than a quietly acquiescent one.
Yeah,
Which is quite a defence.
Yeah,
Isn't that our description on iPlayer?
From the same man who said that there wasn't a toxic culture at the heart of Number 10, and there clearly was, and he knows that. And this is the problem. All of this on Boris's reputation was done way before this inquiry. It was the fact that he told us none of the parties happened, and then they did, and got himself in such a mess over that stuff, which has canned his reputation. And so he's come here and he's kind of said, I liked challenge from them, and the only thing I could tell you is that it was probably a bit male, but it definitely wasn't toxic. The whole reason that it imploded was that Boris chose people that he couldn't control or wouldn't control, and wouldn't lean in and lead and inquire, and that's why we're in the mess that he got himself into.
What I found quite strange watching it is like he is an alpha male, right? And this is going to get a bit pop psychology now, but the whole time he was like almost like a bystander based on his evidence. Like, oh, they were telling me this and it was very hard to understand what they were saying, or they were arguing about it, or I wasn't given enough options. And it was sort of like,
Yeah.
Is that what he's actually like in a situation where he's the decider? And he's actually not an alpha male at all.
Yeah, so he always liked consensus and to hear opposing views in that sort of thing, and then he would make a decision. I think that the Boris Johnson that became Prime Minister was someone, yes, obviously buffeted by events, but also buffeted by people. And Boris's great contradiction and problem is that he wants to be liked by everybody. And you could see a situation during COVID where there'd be a conflicting piece of advice, and in Boris's mind it's like, God, which way do I go? Who am I going to offend in this regard? And that is just not the way to run a response to a pandemic or to run a country.
Aisha, what was your review?
Well, I mean, I think the COVID inquiry has been really fascinating. I know a lot of people have been slagging it off, saying, oh, but it's sort of concentrated on the politics. Well, of course it's concentrated on the politics. This is one of the most important political events that have happened in our lifetimes. It's a huge pandemic, and of course the politics is very important. And I think, for me, I feel like this COVID inquiry is the sort of sequel to the Privileges Committee, and Will is correct.
Where they were investigating whether he'd misled Parliament.
Yes, and I think if the Privileges Committee established that he did mislead Parliament, i.e., what many of us have thought about him for a long time, he's very elastic with the truth, a liar, the L word. I think what the COVID inquiry has done is really shone a light on how his Number 10 operated and why those bad things happened. It's kind of, I can only describe it as sort of a human shambles in sort of Downing Street. And I think his argument, and a lot of people make this argument saying, yeah, but it was a very difficult time. This was a massive crisis. Anybody would have behaved like that. I really disagree with that. I was very close with Alistair Darling. I'd say, for this government, every government has an inflection point of crisis. For this government, it's the pandemic. For the government I was part of, it was the global financial crisis. And that was an incredibly difficult moment as well, when you had Northern Rock and the banking sector being hours away from completely melting down. You didn't see Alistair Darling, you didn't see Number 11 and Number 10 at that time behaving like that. And I think if you did,
except Gordon Brown's team unleashed like a
no, but that was after
that was
afterward. That was after the sort of securing things, and then Alistair Darling did an interview saying things are going to get really tough, and then Damien McBride and others did lots of briefing. But actually, if you look at how they conducted themselves, if you look at how ministers conducted themselves, trust me, they were not behaving like Matt Hack. They weren't going around trying to get off of their advisors, for example. So I really push back against this idea that because you have a crisis, everybody loses their minds and suddenly this terrible behaviour comes to light.
Just very briefly, he proved himself unsuited and unfit, but he could have been, right? There was no toxic culture at City Hall, right? In the people that he surrounded himself with. But if you choose the disruptor in chief to help you run the country, and you light the blue touch paper, you shouldn't be surprised if it goes bang. And that's exactly what happened. And I take Aisha's point that from a leadership perspective, you have to lead from the top. I think he could have led from the top, but he chose the wrong people around him, and he wouldn't confront them when it came down to it after the election in 2019. And that was the point at which these people needed to go. And the real Boris Johnson, the centrist, one nation Tory, could have established himself regardless of the pandemic. He didn't, and the country paid the price.
Will, did you ever advise him not to hire Dominic Cummings?
I did.
Right.
And a couple of other people.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
For legal reasons, let's not get too long a list.
But this is the problem. He'd wanted the job all his life, but he was unprepared for doing it. There was no plan. There was no ideology, and that's why he's come unstuck. And I was very clear with him that there were good things about what Dominic could have done if done in the right way, but it was never going to work on the basis of allowing him that freedom. The Prime Minister is the Prime Minister. He leads, he sets the tone. End of.
My issue I'm having watching the COVID inquiry the last few days is it going to be quite inconclusive? And so Exhibit A, the circuit breaker lockdown, when all the scientists were saying in September 2020, have a 2-week lockdown to just get things under control. England didn't do it. Wales did do it. Numbers of COVID cases in Wales went down, but then 8 days later sprang back up. Did the circuit breaker lockdown work? What would have happened in England if we'd done it? There's probably no way of knowing. And equally, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Okay, you can have the scientists going, well, we actually called it the Eat Out to Help Out the Virus scheme. But then today, Boris Johnson says, well, we did open restaurants. So if it was okay to open restaurants, why was it so bad to give people a tenner to go to them?
I think the other thing from sitting in there and watching it, this goes back to the point Aisha was making earlier on around the criticisms that have been made by some about the inquiry, and is it obsessed too much on the politics or is it obsessed on whatever? When you go in as a political journalist to report on it, of course you're reporting on the politics, that's why you're there, and that will dominate the news. That's not necessarily the same thing as some of the underlying things that the inquiry is looking at. The vast majority of the hearings political journalists are not there for, and that it's going to go on for ages. They could still be doing public hearings in 2026. Now, there's going to be an interim report before then, but the scale of this as a piece of work is huge. Now, some might think it's too big and it should be much quicker and it shouldn't cost as much, but that's where it's trying to get to. The other thing, psychologically, I found myself sitting in there thinking, is the whole business of hindsight bias. So and to be fair, in the scrutiny, they've often asked witnesses to separate what they realised at the time had gone wrong and what they now recognise with hindsight they should have done differently. But it's so hard when you're sitting there knowing how things turned out to be able to truly detach yourself from that and sit yourself back in February 2020 and think what should happen.
There was an interesting point about hindsight yesterday. Hugo Keith picked him up at the very beginning and said, you've written in your statement that you're apologetic, you're sorry for what happened, and that mistakes were made. What were those mistakes? The most extraordinary thing that happened yesterday was Boris couldn't bring himself to list those mistakes. Yeah. And he found it around about
devolution.
Yes.
Yeah? 2 minutes in.
2 minutes in. And
that to levelling up.
And to the point is that goes to the heart of the detail thing with Boris. He's had months to prepare for this. Now, he could have just been avoiding it because he doesn't want to admit he's made mistakes, but it could be that he'd never thought of it in that order. It's a logical question, and you would have thought he would have been able to answer it logically at the beginning.
And then Rishi Sunak has got like a sort of comically stressful week next week, hasn't he? Because he's going to the inquiry on Monday and then there's this Rwanda vote on Tuesday.
As I sat in the press conference with the Prime Minister this morning, I was thinking, hang on a minute, just down the road at Paddington in West London, Boris Johnson's in the chair right now, facing questions from the lawyers. And yeah, Rishi Sunak will be there on Monday. And, of course, the scrutiny and the accountability of whether it be Boris Johnson or Matt Hancock or loads of other folk matters, as well as the lessons learned. But to have the sitting Prime Minister in there, who is a senior figure in government, particularly with all those questions around Eat Out to Help Out, it'll be quite something. And then, as you say, just as he eases off and, thinks, phew, done with all of that, along comes Tuesday.
And we will cover all of those momentous events on successive episodes of Newscast. But thank you very much to everyone for being on this one. Thanks, Will.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Aisha.
Thanks so much.
And yeah, I hope you've got lots of throat sweets for next week, Chris.
I think it's on the mend, just about.
Touch wood, touch wood, touch wood, touch wood. Right, bye. Thanks for listening.
Cheers, bye.
Newscast from the BBC.